She laughed when her ex-husband packed up and moved into a broken-down mansion. But what she didn't know was that he was sitting on a $150 million secret. Imagine watching the person you once loved, laughed with, and built a life with, turn their back on you, convinced you're nothing without them. That's exactly what happened to Marcus Ellington the day he signed the divorce papers. His ex-wife, Danielle Crowley, couldn't wipe the smirk off her face as he packed his bags into the back of his truck, ready to leave everything behind. To her, this was the end of Marcus's comfortable life. To him, though, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. The story begins in Toledo, Ohio, inside a courthouse that smelled faintly of old wood and coffee. Marcus sat quietly at the end of a long oak table, his hands folded neatly, his jaw steady. He wasn't the type to put on a show. He didn't beg, didn't shout, didn't argue. He simply let the judge read the settlement terms, nodded, and signed where he was told. Danielle, on the other hand, practically glowed. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with that smug little smile. To her, it was victory. She had the house in the suburbs, the new SUV, the vacation property in Florida. Marcus walked away with nothing more than a few personal belongings, his old truck, and a mansion she loved to mock. The place was technically his family estate, a sprawling stone mansion just outside Sandusky, sitting on land that had once been beautiful but was now covered in weeds and overgrown vines. To Danielle, it wasn't a home. It was a punchline. She called it a ruined castle, bragging to her friends that Marcus would be living like some washed-up recluse in a haunted shell of a house. When they walked out of the courthouse, Danielle whispered just loud enough for Marcus to hear, "So, you're really going back to that dump? You know, I'd almost feel sorry for you, if I wasn't so busy moving on with my life." Marcus didn't take the bait. He simply lifted his eyes to meet hers and said, "Don't worry about me, Danielle. I'll be just fine." She laughed, a sharp, cutting laugh that drew the attention of people standing nearby. For her, it was the final word. For Marcus, it was just noise. He had bigger things on his mind than a bitter ex-wife's amusement. As he drove away in his old Ford pickup, Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Danielle shrink into the distance. He felt no anger, no regret, just a calm certainty. What Danielle didn't know, what nobody knew, was that Marcus still held the keys to something far greater than the house she mocked. An inheritance his late uncle had left him, quietly tied up in trusts and investments, worth far more than she could ever imagine. But Marcus wasn't the kind of man to brag. He wasn't about to rub it in her face. Instead, he headed toward the mansion with a quiet determination, almost eager to step inside the ruins that Danielle thought symbolized his failure. Because to him, it was never about the walls, or the peeling paint, or the broken windows. It was about rebuilding, about starting fresh. And for the first time in years, Marcus felt a strange sense of freedom. But freedom isn't always comfortable. When he finally pulled into the long gravel driveway, weeds brushing the sides of his truck, the reality of what lay ahead hit him. The house loomed tall and tired, like a giant scarred by time. Windows were cracked, the roof sagged in places, and ivy had nearly swallowed one side of the building. Most people would have turned around right then, not Marcus. He parked, stepped out, and walked up the creaking front steps, the keys heavy in his hand. As he unlocked the door and pushed it open, dust swirled into the air. The mansion groaned like it was waking from a long sleep. Marcus coughed, but he smiled. "Well," he muttered to himself, "let's see what we can do with this." But Danielle's laughter still echoed in his ears, and it wouldn't be long before her smugness turned into something else entirely. The courthouse in downtown Toledo wasn't grand. It wasn't marble floors and gold ceilings like you'd picture in a movie. It was ordinary, gray walls, fluorescent lights, and the faint hum of old air vents. Yet, for Marcus, that room carried the weight of a decade of marriage collapsing into a single morning. As the judge shuffled papers, reading through the list of what belonged to who, Marcus barely moved. He sat with his elbows resting on the table, his eyes steady on the stack of documents in front of him. A pen sat in his hand, though he hadn't written anything yet. His lawyer leaned close and whispered, "You sure about this? You're giving her nearly everything." Marcus didn't blink. "She wants it. She can have it," he said softly. Across from him, Danielle sat in a sharp navy blue blazer. Her nails were perfectly done, bright red, tapping lightly on the table as if she couldn't wait for this to be over. She caught Marcus's words and leaned forward, smirking. "That's because he doesn't have anything left worth fighting for," she said loudly, making sure the room could hear. The judge cleared his throat, but Danielle leaned back again, crossing her legs with a satisfied sigh. Marcus glanced at her, then back at the papers. He signed, slid the sheet forward, and waited for the judge to declare it official. And just like that, a marriage that once had promises of forever was dissolved with ink and silence. When the session ended, Danielle stood quickly, her heels clacking against the linoleum floor. A couple of her friends, women Marcus had seen at their house for book clubs and wine nights, were waiting outside. They greeted her with sympathetic hugs, though their eyes carried the thrill of gossip. Marcus walked past them without a word, pushing the heavy courthouse doors open to step into the gray Ohio sky. Danielle called after him, her voice dripping with false pity. "Good luck in that broken-down mansion of yours, Marcus. Maybe you'll find a raccoon to keep you company." One of her friends giggled, covering her mouth. Danielle smirked again. For her, this wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was a performance, and she wanted the audience to see her win. Marcus turned back once, not with anger, but with something she hadn't expected. Calm, steady. He looked her dead in the eye and said, "I don't need luck. You'll see." The words hung there for a moment, and Danielle's smirk faltered just slightly. She waved him off, pretending not to care, but a shadow of curiosity flickered in her eyes. Outside in the parking lot, Marcus climbed into his truck. The old Ford roared to life, spitting smoke as he shifted it into gear. He gripped the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Divorce wasn't how he pictured his life at 41. He had imagined kids, family dinners, laughter in the backyard. But instead, he had silence. Silence. And a mansion everyone believed was worthless. Still, there was no bitterness in him. He knew Danielle's laughter wouldn't last forever. People often laughed loudest right before the truth caught up with them. He pulled out of the lot, passing Danielle and her friends as they stood gossiping by her shiny new SUV. She looked at him once more, and though her lips curled into a grin, her eyes darted away when he didn't flinch. The road ahead stretched toward Sandusky, where the mansion waited. And Marcus, though outwardly calm, felt the quiet fire of determination burning in his chest. But Danielle didn't just laugh that day. She told stories too, and those stories would soon come back to haunt her. Danielle never wasted time keeping quiet. By the very next weekend, she was sitting at a trendy restaurant in downtown Toledo with 3 of her closest friends, sipping on a glass of Pinot Grigio. The clink of glasses and chatter filled the room, but Danielle's voice carried above the rest. "You should have seen him," she said, leaning across the table. "He signed those papers like it was nothing. Not a word, not a fight, just done. And then, get this, he's actually moving into that old, rotting mansion outside Sandusky." Her friends gasped and laughed, the way people do when they know they probably shouldn't. One of them, a tall woman with short brown hair, shook her head. "That place? The one with the roof falling in? I drove past it last summer. It looked like something out of a horror movie." "Exactly," Danielle said with a smirk. "He thinks he's going to live there like some kind of nobleman. But it's a dump. I almost felt bad for him." "Almost." They laughed again, and Danielle basked in it. For her, Marcus wasn't just an ex-husband. He was a story now. A story she could tell at brunch, at dinner parties, anywhere someone would listen. Every detail exaggerated just enough to keep the spotlight on her. Later that evening, Danielle found herself on the phone with her sister, who lived in Columbus. "Yeah, it's official," she said, swirling the last of her wine. "Marcus gave me the house, the car, everything. And what did he take? That broken mansion. I told him maybe the raccoons would keep him company." She laughed at her own joke, pausing for effect. "Honestly, it's sad. He'll probably never date again. Who'd want to live in a place like that?" Her sister chuckled on the other end, but even she sounded unsure. "Well, you never really know with Marcus. He was always private." Danielle waved the comment away, even though no one could see her. "Please, he's private because he has nothing. He's finished, and I don't have to worry about him anymore." But what Danielle didn't realize was that people talk. And stories, once they leave your lips, have a way of circling back. Friends told friends, whispers spread, and before long, Marcus's name was being spoken in living rooms and workplaces across town. Not as the man who lost everything, but as the man people couldn't quite figure out. At a local hardware store in Sandusky, two clerks behind the counter were talking while Marcus quietly loaded wood and paint supplies onto a cart. One whispered, "Isn't that the guy whose wife left him? She's been telling everybody he's living in that old mansion." The other clerk glanced over at Marcus, who stood calm, unbothered, focused on his list. "Yeah," he said, "but doesn't he seem a little too collected for someone who's supposedly broke?" Marcus overheard them but didn't react. He simply pushed his cart forward, paid in cash, and nodded politely. If Danielle wanted to turn him into a story, that was fine. Stories have a way of changing once the truth surfaces. Meanwhile, Danielle's mockery only grew louder. At a friend's birthday party, she told the tale again, this time embellishing further. "He walked into that house like he was moving into a palace," she said dramatically, earning roars of laughter from the circle around her. "I swear, one good storm and the whole roof will come crashing down on his head." Everyone laughed, and Danielle smiled wider. To her, this was entertainment, proof she had won. But while she was busy laughing, Marcus was busy working, and every nail he hammered, every wall he painted, was bringing him closer to a truth Danielle wasn't ready to face. The drive from Toledo to Sandusky wasn't long, but it felt heavier than usual. Marcus's truck rattled along the highway, the bed weighed down with boxes of clothes, tools, and a few keepsakes. He didn't take much with him. Truth be told, there wasn't much he wanted to take. What he really carried with him was a mix of resolve and silence. As he turned off the main road onto the cracked driveway leading to the Ellington estate, the house came into view like an old photograph pulled from a drawer. Time had not been kind to it. The once white stone walls were now stained with streaks of black from years of rain. Windows were clouded and broken in spots, the wooden shutters hanging crookedly. Ivy crept up the walls, nearly swallowing the southern side of the mansion. The lawn, if you could even call it that, was a tangle of waist-high grass and weeds. Marcus slowed the truck and parked near the front steps. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, and just stood there for a moment, staring at the building. Memories of summers spent running through those very halls with his cousins, of his uncle hosting family gatherings on the lawn, all flashed back. It was hard to reconcile those memories with what stood before him now. Still, he didn't grimace. He didn't sigh. Instead, he muttered to himself, "All right, let's get to work." He walked up the steps, each one groaning under his weight, and slid the heavy iron key into the lock. The door creaked as it opened, releasing a rush of stale air. Dust floated in the sunlight that cut through the cracked glass above the entryway. Inside, the grand foyer stretched before him. Marble floors dulled by dirt, a chandelier hanging askew, and cobwebs spun thick in the corners. Marcus set down his bag and walked slowly through the space, dragging his fingers across the dusty railing of the staircase. The silence was heavy, but it didn't scare him. It steadied him. "Looks worse than I remember," he said softly, his voice echoing through the empty hall. Then, with a small smirk, he added, "But I've fixed worse things." Later that evening, after unloading his belongings, Marcus pulled a folding chair into the center of the foyer. He sat down with a thermos of coffee and just looked around. The house was silent except for the occasional creak as it settled. Some would have called it depressing, but Marcus saw potential. Every cracked tile, every broken window, every sagging beam was something he could repair, something he could bring back. The first night wasn't easy. He unrolled a sleeping bag on the floor of what had once been the library. The fireplace was filled with ash from years past, but Marcus got it working again with some wood he'd brought. The firelight danced across the tall, dusty shelves, casting shadows across the room. He lay there in the warmth, staring at the ceiling, Danielle's mocking words still ringing faintly in his ears. "She thinks I'm finished," he whispered to himself. "She has no idea." In the morning, Marcus woke to sunlight pouring through the cracked blinds. He walked outside with a cup of coffee and stood on the steps, surveying the property. The mansion looked tired, yes, but under that exhaustion was strength. Like a boxer, beaten but not broken, waiting for the bell to ring again. Marcus smiled. He knew it would take years of work, maybe longer, but he had two things Danielle never understood about him: patience and vision. But what Marcus didn't realize just yet was how quickly word of his return to the mansion would spread, and how Danielle's laughter would soon turn into whispers she couldn't control. The first week in the mansion was nothing short of exhausting. Marcus woke up before sunrise, pulled on an old pair of jeans, and started working. Every day had a new task. scraping layers of paint off the windows, pulling weeds that had grown thick as rope, hauling broken furniture out to the driveway to be hauled off later. By the end of each night, his back ached and his hands were blistered, but there was a strange satisfaction in the pain. Inside the house, the air smelled of dust and age. He spent hours sweeping floors, scrubbing walls, and opening windows to let light pour back into rooms that had been shut for years. The grand dining hall was the hardest to face at first. Once a place of long dinners and laughter, it now looked like a forgotten relic, chairs overturned, table cracked, curtains eaten by moths. Marcus stood in the doorway one afternoon, taking it all in. "Don't worry," he said aloud, his voice firm despite the emptiness. "We'll get you back." Talking to the house became a habit. He spoke to it the way someone might talk to a friend, quietly, matter-of-factly, as though the walls could hear him. And in a way, maybe they did. Still, the nights were the toughest. The silence stretched on too long, broken only by the sound of the wind rattling the windows or the distant cry of an animal in the woods. Marcus would sit in front of the fireplace, a mug of coffee in hand, staring into the flames. Loneliness pressed on him, but he refused to call anyone. He knew if he reached out, it would feel like weakness, and he wasn't willing to give Danielle that victory, even indirectly. One evening, as Marcus was hauling out broken boards from the old sunroom, a neighbor stopped by. An older man in his 60s, wearing a ball cap and carrying a toolbox, walked up the driveway. "You must be Ellington's boy," the man said, extending his hand. Marcus wiped his palms on his jeans before shaking it. "That's me. And you are?" "Name's Howard Bell. Live about 2 miles down the road. Used to help your uncle with some repairs around here." Marcus nodded, smiling slightly. "Good to meet you, Howard. Place looks a little rough these days, huh?" Howard chuckled. "Rough's one word for it. Most folks around here figured this place would just rot away. Didn't think anyone would try to bring it back." Marcus shrugged. "Most folks weren't raised in it." Howard studied him for a moment, then tipped his cap. "Well, if you need an extra pair of hands, I've still got some tools, and a lot of free time." That night, Marcus sat by the fire again, thinking about the offer. He'd always been self-reliant, but even he knew the work ahead was bigger than just one man. Maybe help wasn't weakness after all. But while he was slowly breathing life back into the house, Danielle was still out there, spinning her stories louder than ever. She thought Marcus was drowning, but the truth was, he was finally learning how to swim on his own. But Danielle's circle of friends wasn't the only one keeping tabs. Rumors about Marcus's real fortune were starting to spark, and those whispers had a way of growing louder. While Danielle was busy polishing her new life for friends to admire, Marcus was quietly tending to matters she knew nothing about. The Ellington mansion wasn't just a house. It was a key. His late uncle, Richard Ellington, had been a shrewd investor and businessman, the kind of man who thought 5 steps ahead of everyone else. When Richard passed away, most assumed he'd left nothing more than memories and that run-down estate. What few people realized was that Richard had structured his wealth carefully, tied up in trusts and real estate portfolios that were only accessible to Marcus. One afternoon, Marcus drove into downtown Sandusky to meet with a financial advisor his uncle had trusted for years. The office was tucked into a modest brick building near the lakefront. Nothing flashy, nothing to draw attention. Marcus walked in wearing his usual work jeans and boots, which earned him a quick glance from the receptionist before she led him to a back office. "Mr. Ellington," the advisor, a man named Douglas Grant, said as he stood to shake his hand, "I wasn't sure when you'd come in. Richard always said you'd take your time." Marcus gave a polite smile. "I like to keep things quiet." Douglas opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the desk. "Well, quiet is good, because what's in here would cause quite a stir if people knew." Marcus sat down and flipped the folder open. Inside were documents, trust accounts, property deeds, investment statements, line after line of numbers stacked neatly, balances that would make most people dizzy. Douglas tapped one page in particular. "Your uncle left you the controlling interest in several commercial properties across Ohio and Michigan. The trust holds about $150 million in assets, liquid and otherwise. It's all yours, and all off the radar. Nobody but you and I know the details." Marcus studied the paper for a long moment before closing the folder. He didn't grin, didn't gloat, didn't even exhale heavily. He just nodded. "Good. That's how I want to keep it." Douglas raised an eyebrow. "Most people in your shoes would be shouting this from the rooftops." "I'm not most people," Marcus replied. Driving back to the mansion, Marcus thought about Danielle. She had laughed, told her friends he was broke, and paraded her version of victory through restaurants and phone calls. If she only knew the truth, that the man she mocked was worth far more than the SUV she bragged about, she'd choke on her laughter. But Marcus wasn't interested in revenge. His satisfaction didn't come from rubbing her nose in what she'd lost. It came from standing in the silence of the mansion, watching beams of sunlight stretch across the dusty floorboards, knowing he had the power to rebuild not only the house, but his life. That evening, he pulled out the old family ledger from a wooden chest in the library. His uncle had kept detailed notes about the estate from the day it was built in the early 1900s until his final years. Marcus flipped through the yellowed pages, smiling faintly at the handwriting he recognized. In the margins were small notes like, "Keep this property for family only," and "One day, this place will rise again." Marcus leaned back in his chair, running a hand over the pages. "I'll do it, Uncle Richard," he said quietly. "I'll bring it back." The fire crackled beside him, casting a glow across the room. He didn't need Danielle to know. He didn't need anyone to clap for him. The mansion was his applause, his inheritance the quiet truth, and his patience the weapon she never saw coming. But secrets never stay buried forever, and soon Danielle's friends would hear whispers that Marcus wasn't just surviving. He might be thriving in ways she never imagined. By late spring, the Ellington mansion was no longer the ruined castle Danielle loved to mock. The roof had been repaired, fresh paint brightened the windowsills, and the lawn, once wild and tangled, was trimmed into neat lines. Marcus had spent months pouring sweat into every inch of the property, sometimes with Howard's help, sometimes with contractors he paid quietly in cash. To anyone driving past, it looked like the house was waking up again. Word traveled fast. Small towns always carried rumors like wildfire. Some whispered Marcus had come into money. Others said he was just stubborn, working himself into the ground for pride. But either way, people were talking. And talk inevitably reached Danielle. She heard it first through a mutual friend, a woman named Karen Becker, who showed up at Danielle's dinner party with a curious tone. "So, is it true Marcus is fixing up that place? Somebody told me he's had crews out there almost every week." Danielle rolled her eyes and waved it off. "Please. Marcus? He probably patched a hole in the roof with duct tape and called it a renovation." But Karen pressed. "Well, my husband drove by last week, said it looked different, not falling apart anymore." Danielle's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She forced a laugh, but something inside her twisted. "Trust me, he's broke. He's living on fumes. Whatever you saw, it's just an act." Yet that night, long after the guests had gone, Danielle scrolled her phone restlessly, trying to find a picture, a post, anything that proved Marcus was bluffing. There was nothing. Marcus had no social media, no public footprint. Silence. That silence ate at her. A week later, Danielle drove to Sandusky under the excuse of running errands. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. But when she turned onto the long gravel driveway and saw the mansion, her jaw tightened. The house stood tall again, proud in its stature. Fresh shingles lined the roof, the windows gleamed, and the grass swayed neatly in the breeze. It wasn't perfect yet, but it was far from the wreck she had last seen. Marcus was outside near the porch, unloading lumber from his truck. He looked up as her SUV crunched down the drive. His face stayed calm, unreadable. Danielle rolled down the window halfway. "Well," she said, forcing a laugh, "looks like you've been busy." Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, leaning casually against the railing. "Busy enough." Danielle stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the gravel. "You didn't tell me you were actually doing all this. Everyone's been talking." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Why would I tell you?" She smirked, though her eyes darted across the mansion. "So, what's the deal, Marcus? You win the lottery? Get a secret job you never told me about?" Marcus chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You really think money is something I needed from you?" Danielle stiffened. "Then where is all this coming from?" Marcus studied her for a long moment before answering. "Let's just say not everything I had was on paper in that courtroom. Some things aren't meant to be public." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, the laugh she'd carried for months wavered. She tried to regain it, crossing her arms. "Well, good for you, I guess." Marcus stepped closer, his tone even. Danielle, you spent so much time telling everyone I was finished, you forgot something. I don't need to prove you wrong. All I have to do is keep living, and that's exactly what I'm doing. The silence stretched between them. Danielle shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the mansion again. It looked nothing like the joke she'd made it out to be, but Danielle still hadn't seen the full picture, and soon, the truth about just how much Marcus had inherited would hit her harder than any insult ever could. Danielle couldn't get the image of the mansion out of her head. For weeks she had laughed at the thought of Marcus living in squalor, and now she had seen with her own eyes that the house wasn't dying. It was coming alive. That bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The breaking point came one Saturday afternoon when she ran into an old mutual acquaintance at a cafe in downtown Toledo. He leaned across the table, lowering his voice. You know, I heard Marcus has more money than people think. My cousin works at a bank in Sandusky. Said he came in with documents tied to some trust. Big numbers. We're not talking pocket change. Danielle froze, her cup halfway to her lips. She forced a laugh, but her chest tightened. Oh, please, Marcus. He doesn't even own a decent suit. The man just shrugged. Suit or not, people say he's worth more than you could imagine. That night, Danielle sat in her kitchen alone, staring at her wine glass. She remembered every mocking comment she'd made, every story she'd exaggerated, every laugh she had shared at Marcus's expense. And now the possibility that she had walked away from someone who wasn't ruined at all but quietly thriving, that cut deeper than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, Marcus's life was steadily building. Contractors finished repairing the east wing of the mansion. The library had new shelves, the dining hall had a polished table again, and the gardens, once a mess of weeds, were taking shape. Neighbors who had once whispered now stopped by to admire his work. Some even offered to lend a hand. One evening, Marcus hosted a small dinner in the dining hall. Howard sat at the table with his wife, along with a few other locals who had grown fond of Marcus's determination. The laughter in that room was real, warm, nothing like the hollow kind Danielle had paraded at her parties. As plates were passed around, Howard raised his glass. To new beginnings. This house was dying. Now look at it. You brought it back, Marcus. Marcus smiled humbly, lifting his own glass. I didn't do it alone. I just kept showing up. But later that week, Danielle appeared one last time. She pulled into the driveway, her SUV gleaming, but her eyes less certain than before. Marcus was trimming the hedges when she approached. I heard things, she began, her voice lower than usual. People are saying you came into money, that you've been hiding something all this time. Marcus paused, setting down the shears. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. Why does it matter to you, Danielle? Her lips parted, but she didn't have an answer. Finally, she said, I thought you were finished. I thought you had nothing. Marcus nodded slowly. And you laughed at me for it. But here's the thing. You shouldn't measure people by what they lose. You should measure them by what they do with what they still have. You saw failure. I saw opportunity. She looked down, embarrassed, fidgeting with her keys. For once, she had no clever remark. Marcus walked past her, heading back toward the house. Over his shoulder, he added, Sometimes losing what you think you need is the only way to find out what you're really capable of. Danielle stood frozen as Marcus disappeared inside, the sound of the heavy door closing echoing in her ears. In the end, Marcus didn't need revenge. The mansion, the inheritance, and the peace he found in rebuilding spoke louder than anything else. Danielle's laughter had faded, replaced by silence, and maybe even regret. And that's the lesson here. Never assume someone's story ends just because a chapter closed. Don't measure others by what they seem to have lost. People can surprise you. They can rebuild, grow, and rise in ways you never expected. If you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or written off, remember Marcus's story. Keep building, keep working, and let your results speak for you. Because sometimes the best response isn't anger or revenge, it's success. If this story made you think twice about judging others too quickly, share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, every ending can be the start of a new beginning.